post up the slides. You have the usual 45 minutes. Then last 10 minutes, we'll open the mic to people want to ask their question live, but we'll give you instructions for those of you who are not frequent flyers. So, Pauline, it's fantastic to have you here. Just go for it.
Thank you, Giacomo, and thank you all for attending. So the project I'm going to present is joint with Pascaline Dupas, Christelle Mabeu, and Camille Falezan. And Camille is here with us today to handle questions in the chat. Thank you, Camille, for doing that. In this project, we are trying to connect two important ideas. One, that the economy matters for fertility, and two, that history matters for the economy. So the first one is a really central idea in demography, that, well, production determines reproduction, meaning that the organization of productive activities determines fertility behaviors. And in the context of Africa, this idea has mostly been used to try to explain variation in pre-colonial family structures, like why ethnic groups traditionally involved in pastoralism tend to have lower fertility than those involved in farming, for example. But we know much less about the response of this traditional family structure to colonization. And we expect a response because of the second idea, that the colonial rule disrupted the organization of production and that these disruptions had long-lasting consequences for African economies. In particular, we are interested in one dimension that has been relatively understudied, even though it affected many people in many colonial empires, and this is the forced reallocation of labor across places. So we want to know whether this colonial forced labor migration has affected fertility behaviors and preferences in sub-Saharan Africa, and we want to understand whether the impact is mediated by changes in the organization of production. We study this context in this question in the context of Burkina Faso for two reasons. First, this colony was considered by the French as their major pool of workers in West Africa, and they sent hundreds of thousands of young men to work for 1 to 2 years in neighboring colonies that were perceived as more economically promising at the time. The second reason is that we can exploit the temporary partition of Burkina Faso into 3 zones with different needs for labor as a special regression discontinuity design. What we find is that in villages historically more exposed to forced labor migration, there is today a lower realized fertility and desired fertility. And the persistence channel that we emphasize is voluntary circular migration. So what we found out was that in one of the destinations, Côte d'Ivoire, the demand for labor was sustained over time, even after the end of colonization. And young men used migration networks dating back to colonial times to go and work there for some years, but voluntarily this time. So we can show that in villages historically more exposed to forced labor migration, there is today more temporary migration to Côte d'Ivoire among young men. And there is also more remittances flowing in these villages. So there is an income effect, and when people are richer, they tend to have fewer children. The final challenge of the project was to understand how this income effect operates exactly. And this is because we find an effect on fertility, but we find no effect on the usual correlates of low fertility. In particular, we find no effect on human capital and no effect on female empowerment. So this is not a story of labor migration transforming returns to schooling or gender dynamics. What is different in these villages is that people rely less on subsistence farming. So we show that people farm smaller plots, that children are less likely to work on the farm, and that adults report lower need for child labor. We also find that the effects are driven by areas where the soil is suited for labor-intensive crops. That is, areas where initially children played a key role in agriculture because adults are growing plants that require a lot of care. And so for these reasons, we believe that the most likely channel of operation for the income effect is a reduction in the need for child labor in agriculture. So the paper is at the intersection of two big interdisciplinary literature, one on the causes of fertility in Africa and the second one on the consequences of colonialism. The first literature is basically asking whether Africa's fertility is exceptional. And today there is a near consensus that the decline is indeed particularly late and particularly slow in Africa. There is no consensus on the causes, and the main debate is about the relative role of cultural factors versus economic factors. Now, very few studies directly relate these factors to colonization. There are a few exceptions looking at the role of colonial population policies and the role of Christian missions. And our paper is the first to quantify the role of forced labor migration. And we show that it operates through an economic factor, namely the need for child labor. So we learned something about the key drivers of fertility in this context. The second literature has documented the adverse consequences of colonialism in general and in extractive institutions in particular. On forced labor specifically, there are only a few studies trying to quantify the magnitude of forced labor and to quantify the long-term impact on development. And our paper is the first to quantify the impact on fertility and to show that the sustained demand for labor at destination is key to generate the long-term impact. So we learned something about the conditions necessary for persistence. And finally, when we talk about the mechanism, we relate to a literature on the consequences of migration, in particular the literature on the long-run effects of temporary labor migration on places of origin. So in the migration literature, studies are often interested in the effect on migrants themselves or on the households sending migrants. But in our context, households in a village are very much interconnected and they form a bigger unit of production. So we think it makes more sense to look at the more macro effect on the whole sending community because they are all affected by migration. And this is what has been done by a few papers in other contexts, looking at the effect on human capital and physical capital and structural transformation, but not at fertility. The papers in the migration literature looking at fertility tend to emphasize the concept of cultural remittances. So this is the idea that migrants bring back home the values that they have learned at destination. In our context, it's quite different for two reasons. One, because migration started with coercion, and we believe that initial conditions may matter. And second, because the norms on family size are quite similar in Burkina Faso and in Côte d'Ivoire, so the cultural remittances cannot be the main mechanism here. Okay. So let me give you a bit more information about the historical background. At the beginning of the 20th century, the French colonized parts of West Africa, and they set up the Afrique occidentale française, AOF, that they split into several colonies. So the Burkina Faso is here in the middle. It was called Haute-Volta at the time. And then the colony itself that I represent here was divided into administrative units called circles. Now, for the French, this territory was very special because it was poor in terms of natural resources, but rich in terms of human resources. And in particular, the largest ethnic group, the Mossi, was seen by the French as populous and quote-unquote obedient. So I'm just going to show you a few quotes to illustrate that. This one is from the governor of the AOF, and he talks about the colony, and he says that this is the reservoir of human energy for the other colonies of the group. The colony has more than 3 million inhabitants. It's 1/4 of the total population of French West Africa. It is therefore normal that this population be called upon to participate in works of a general interest to the Federation. So what the French liked in particular about the Mossi was the centralization of power in this society. And the second quote are some historians arguing that the aristocracy and the elders continued during the 30s and 40s to exercise power over the peasant masses. This authority was, however, under the close control of the colonial administration, And as a result, the rural Mossi area was a much more important center of male labor than the rest of rural Burkina. So to facilitate these movements of labor, the French decided in 1932 to dismantle the colony and to allocate the different administrative units to the free neighbors. So these units here were allocated to Côte d'Ivoire in the south. These units here were allocated to French Sudan, which is Mali today, in the north. And these units here were allocated to Niger in the east. For Côte d'Ivoire and French Sudan, it was clearly driven by economic reasons to reallocate labor to more profitable colonies. And I'm going to tell you in a few slides how it worked exactly. For Niger, it was different. It was more driven by political reasons to shift the center of gravity of the colony away from the east and towards the west, because the east was at that time under the influence of northern Nigeria, which was a British colony at the time. But they didn't need labor for any specific project on that side. The partition lasted for 15 years, and after the Second World War, the AOF was reorganized once again, forced labor was abolished, and the Mossi elite obtained the reunification of the colony. In 1960, the country became independent, new administrative regions were drawn, and the country changed the name to Burkina Faso. So a few words about how forced labor worked. There were two major infrastructure projects that needed labor. One on the Côte d'Ivoire side, that's the Mossi Railroad between Abidjan and Ouagadougou that was completed in 1954. And another one in French Sudan, which was a large irrigation project in the Niger River that failed and was abandoned after 1945. Now, on top of this public work, and only in Côte d'Ivoire, workers were also sent to private companies producing cash crops like wood, coffee, and cocoa. And as we will see, these private companies are going to play a key role in the persistence and in the sustained demand for labor after colonization. On the Niger side, it was quite different. There was no massive relocation of workers. Sometimes people were asked to work in the periphery of their villages, but no one was sent to a different colony. In terms of implementation, a quota was set every year by the French administration, depending on the needs for public work and the requests sent by private companies. And then the village chiefs were in charge of identifying and delivering the workers. Workers were typically employed for 1 to 2 years, and they were paid, but the wage was very low and the working conditions were extremely difficult. In terms of scope, historians estimate that at least 420,000 people participated in this system over the 15 years of partition. This is out of a population of roughly 3 million. So this means that this is approximately 30% of the male population that was affected. These were mostly Mossi, young, single rural men. And so here it's important to see how the Mossi family is structured. You have the household head, his wives and his children. And then you have some male relatives who are not married yet and live with the head. And these men are called family helpers. It's their status in the household. And these are the men who were sent back in the days in colonial times. And these are the men who are still participating today in this voluntary migration. So they go work for some years, then they come back, they get married, and they start their own household. So it's not the household head who's participating in the migration. To try to document a bit more formally this variation in exposure across circles, we spend a lot of time in the archives in Abidjan and in Dakar to try to get numbers for how many people were sent every year per circle. So I say we, but this is mostly Pascaline and Camille who spent a lot of time there. We managed to find data for 6 years before, during, and after the partition. Here I'm only showing the year 1930 as an example. And what is really clear is that the circles allocated to Niger in gray, so these circles here, they were exempted from from this forced contract labor. So no one was sent to railroad, public or private work, contrary to the circles allocated to Côte d'Ivoire in pink and the circles allocated to French Sudan in orange. If we look at other forms of forced labor, like conscription in the army or the labor tax, there is less variation across circles. So it's really on the contract labor that the Niger circles stand out. Another exception is Gawa here. This is this circle. There is no Mossi there, and the French never completely controlled the territory. So we are going to use this additional source of variation within the side allocated to Côte d'Ivoire as an additional empirical test later on. So I guess you see where I'm going here. The idea will be to use this differential exposure to forced labor migration as a special regression discontinuity design. The border of interest is going to be here between the side allocated to Niger that we consider as not exposed and the side allocated to Côte d'Ivoire that we consider as exposed. We can use a placebo border here between the orange side allocated to French Sudan and the pink side allocated to Côte d'Ivoire as a placebo in the sense that both sides were exposed. So we can rule out the fact that the difference between Côte d'Ivoire and Niger comes from a factor specific to Côte d'Ivoire. So as a shortcut, I'm going to always say the Côte d'Ivoire side and the Niger side. In fact, it's the part of Burkina Faso historically allocated to Côte d'Ivoire and the part of Burkina Faso historically allocated to Niger. We're only going to look at today's Burkina Faso for the analysis. The last point that you can see on this slide is this blue shaded area here. And these correspond to the Mossi homeland from the Murdoch's Atlas, so the area where historically a lot of Mossi were living. As you can see, the partition cuts through the homeland, and this is on purpose because the French wanted to give a bit of the Mossi land to each of the free neighbors. And this means that we can either use ethnicity fixed effect or restrict our analysis to the Mossi land to make sure that we are always comparing the same ethnic groups on both sides of the border. So to do the analysis, we need two types of data. We need first historical data to be able to construct this map. Because as I said, these borders do not exist anymore. The new administrative regions do not coincide with the old circles. So we needed first to create this map. And so to do that, we went to the French archives to find maps from the colonial times, and we digitized them. So the maps are very detailed. We show an example here. There are some geographical coordinates. If you see in the back, there's here 0 degree, 12 degree. And so we created a code that would extract the red line from these images. The red lines are the borders between circles that we're going to use later in the analysis. And so here I want to thank again Camille, who spent a lot of time on this process to create a Python code that extract in an automatic way as much as possible the information. So to go from the picture in the archive to the shapefile with only a few manual steps. Once we have this map, we can overlay the map onto any other contemporary data set that has GPS coordinates. So here we are going to use 3 data sets. One is the DHS, the Demographic and Health Surveys that most of you know, I guess. There are 4 waves in Burkina Faso between 1993 and 2010. The great thing with DHS is that it's nationally representative and there is a great coverage. So we have 40,000 households in 1,400 clusters with a lot of villages along the border of interest. The main disadvantage if you have used DHS is you know that the precise GPS coordinates is not available. For privacy reasons, they add a noise up to 5 kilometers. And so for villages that are less than 5 kilometers away from the border, we don't know on which side they are, in fact. So for the analysis, we exclude these villages. but this is not completely satisfactory. And so we complement the analysis with another data set that we collected ourselves. We call this data set BFAB, and this was as part of an RCT. We conducted a survey with 27,000 people in 500 villages. Compared to DHS, it's not nationally representative. You can see that we work only in half of the provinces, and it's also only rural areas, whereas DHS has cities and villages. But still, we have a good number of observations along the border within the Mosiland. And so we can use this data set because here we observe the precise location of the villages because we collected the data ourselves. And then to look at the mechanism, we use the LSMS collected in 2018-19 to get data on migration, remittances, time use, productive assets, and occupation. The main issue with LSMS is that we have only 600 clusters and 7,000 households, and we don't have a lot of observations on the Niger side, close to the border. So for the analysis is going to be a bit more descriptive. We are only going to compare averages on both sides of the border within a small bandwidth, but we won't be able to estimate the proper discontinuity with this data. Okay, so I'm going to be rather quick on this because we don't do anything special. We estimate a very standard spatial RD. The coefficient of interest is beta that estimates the discontinuity right at the border between the side that we considered as exposed, so historically allocated to Côte d'Ivoire, and the other side, controlling for the distance to the border. In the paper, we provide 40 pages appendix, with all the robustness test that goes with the spatial RD, changing the standard error, the bandwidth, the polynomial, etc. We also discuss in detail in the paper the validity of the design. So we talk about the endogenous placement of the border, the selective sorting around the border, and the different exposure to other policies, colonial and post-colonial policies across circles. And we try to argue that the design is valid. But if there is no pressing question on this topic, I'm going to move to the results, and I'm happy to take more questions about that in the Q&A.
It seems to be totally clear, so go for it.
Okay, so this is our main graph. On the x-axis, we show the distance to the border. So the gray side is Niger, not exposed, and the pink side is Côte d'Ivoire exposed. And on the y-axis, we show the annual birth rate. The magnitude is around 0.3 per year. So that means that you have a birth every 3 to 4 years, and that corresponds at the end of the life cycle to around 7 children. And what you can see is that the pink dots, so the exposed side, they are always below the gray dots, except for this point here, which is a city, corresponds to a city on the Niger side. But otherwise, there is a clear discontinuity right at the border. The magnitude of the discontinuity is around 2 percentage points. Again, this is per year. So after 25 years of reproductive life, it's around half a child, the difference between the non-exposed and exposed side. Here we pull all the DHS and BFAB together to maximize the precision. If we look at the data sets separately, BFAB is on the left and DHS on the right. The slopes are different because, again, it's not the same sampling, it's not the same period. Especially in DHS, you have cities that you can see here that are outliers. We don't see them in BFAB that only looks at villages, but we can see the discontinuity in both data sets. In the table, we look at many other outcomes. So in that table, I show first in panel A the BFAB dataset, in panel B the DHS dataset. Annual birth rate is what we just looked at. We can also look at total births for women of reproductive age, completed fertility for older women, desired fertility for men and for women. In the odd columns, we show all the ethnic groups having an ethnic group fixed effect, and on the even columns, we show only the mossy land. And as you will see, the coefficients are always a little bit larger when we restrict to the mossy land. So we confirm the difference of around 2 percentage points for the annual birth rate, and the difference of around half a child for the completed fertility. And the effects are always significant. When we look at desired fertility, the coefficients are negative everywhere, but they are significant and large only for men. So the reduction in fertility seems to be driven mostly by a change in men's preferences rather than in women's preferences. If we look at the placebo border, so the one where we expect no effect because both sides were exposed, this is what we see. So there is no discontinuity on this graph. And if we look at the table, we also find no significant effect at this placebo border. So in the same spirit of this placebo, we can look at other boundaries. If we go back to the numbers we get from the archives, we can classify the circles into low, medium, and high exposure. And then we can do all sorts of natural experiments. So we can look at this border here between high and low exposure where we expect a large effect. At the border between medium and high exposure, we expect a smaller effect. And at any border between high and high, we expect no effect. So here I'm showing you on this graph, these different exercises that we do. BFAP data is in blue, DHS is in purple. And we order them on the x-axis in terms of expected effect size. And we show the RD coefficient for annual birth rate. And the patterns are broadly in line with what we expect. When we have the high versus high comparisons, we find no significant effect. When we do the high versus low comparison, we have a large negative effect. And we have something in the middle for the high versus medium comparison.
Pauline, just a clarification, maybe some people are not very familiar with the donut design. Can you just go back and say why there is this missing little part close to the border?
Yes, so here you can see that we remove the point that is at 5 kilometers away from the border. So this is the donut RD. And this is because in DHS, we don't observe the exact location of the villages. So if a village is less than 2 kilometers, is at 2 kilometers away from the border, since there is a noise that goes up to 5 kilometers, maybe in fact it's on the other side of the border. So this creates some measurement error, and that's why we do the donut. We don't have to do it with BFAB because with BFAB we measure the exact location of the villages. Okay. Okay, so there seems to be this negative relationship between forced labor migration in the past and fertility today. And we're going to argue that the persistence channel is voluntary migration. And in fact, Burkina Faso is a very well-known case study among demographers for circular migration. So that's a way to describe the very large flows of people who go from Burkina Faso to Côte d'Ivoire and back to Burkina Faso after a few years. And historians explain that this transition from forced migration to voluntary migration has been gradual. So first, after the Second World War, when forced labor was abolished and Burkina Faso was reunified, private employers in Côte d'Ivoire responded by setting up a syndicate. So for those who speak French, the name is very telling. It's Syndicat Interprofessionnel d'Acheminement de la Main-d'œuvre. So the goal of the syndicate was really to keep attracting workers in their plantation. And to do that, they improved the wage and they improved the working conditions. But at that time, the historians would say that some form of coercion remained. What employers did also in Côte d'Ivoire was, so first taking advantage of the networks that were built during the partition and already oriented towards Côte d'Ivoire, but then they also redirected the flows that used to go to French Sudan, but were no longer needed there because the irrigation project had been abandoned. And so they redirected these flows of workers towards the plantations in Côte d'Ivoire that still needed a lot of labor. In terms of magnitude, it's around 260,000 people participating between 1947 and 1959, so a little bit less than the magnitude that was estimated during the partition. Then this really after independence that there is this boom in temporary migration to Côte d'Ivoire, and this boom corresponds to the boom of the cocoa sector in Côte d'Ivoire. So that's really when the sector exploded, and that they needed a lot of immigrant workers to grow the cocoa. And we found a national migration survey already conducted in the 70s that was interesting because it shows that the heterogeneity within the sending communities in Burkina Faso persists over time. If you look at the side of Burkina Faso that was historically allocated to Niger, it's only 7% of males who are in the rural Mossi area reported as temporary immigrants, compared to 17% in Côte d'Ivoire and French Sudan. So in the 70s, we see still that the Niger side sends less people to Côte d'Ivoire, and now we are in the area after in the moment after independence. So we can also more formally test that in our data, because in DHS there is a question asking how many times have you been away from home in the past 12 months? And we can see that on the exposed side of the border, men are more likely to have been away from home in the past year. And the magnitude is pretty large compared to the mean, especially when we restrict to the Mossi land. We can use the LSMS data to know where these men go, and as expected, they go to Côte d'Ivoire. So if we look at the control group for the unexposed side, it's around 5 percentage points of men who report that they have lived in Côte d'Ivoire at some point, and they are 10 percentage points more likely to have lived in Côte d'Ivoire if they are on the other side of the border. If we ask, have you lived outside of Burkina Faso but not in Côte d'Ivoire, the numbers are very, very small. So basically in this context, migration abroad is always migration to Côte d'Ivoire. Again, the caveat here is that we are only comparing averages between both sides of the border. We don't do the proper RD with the LSMS data. So we think that we have a pretty strong argument also combined with the history and demography literature that the colonial forced labor migration led to circular migration today. And now the final question is, how do we go from this circular migration to a reduction in fertility? Because here you have, in theory, a lot of different mechanisms that are plausible. But in fact, there is only one causal chain that is supported by the data. So I'm going to show you now in the remaining time evidence for each of these steps in this causal chain. And at the end, I'm also going to tell you the other hypothesis that we have tested. So the idea is that migrants send part of their income to the village as remittances, and this reduces villagers' reliance on agriculture for food consumption, which decreases the value of child and family labor, and therefore the incentives to have a high fertility. So I'm going to show you a table for each of these links, and I'm also going to show you that in places where this link here between reliance on agriculture and need for family labor, when this link is weak because people grow crops that do not require a lot of labor, then the causal chain breaks and there is no effect. So if we start with remittances, we see that people on the exposed side receive more remittances. So this is in francs CFA, but if I translate in euro, this is a difference on average of 40 euros per year additional. That's compared to a GDP per capita of around 800 euros. So that's around 5% of the annual income. That's the magnitude you should have in mind. This effect is mostly driven by, only driven by the extensive margin. So on the exposed side, people are 15 percentage points more likely to receive at least one transfer, but conditional on receiving a transfer, the amount is the same. So what seems to matter is really the possibility to send someone rather than the quality of the move. And as we expect, the sender lives in Côte d'Ivoire. So then we argue that these remittances changed a bit the modes of production in villages. If we look at the main occupation, there is no effect. The main occupation is always agriculture in this context. But there is an effect in the time use. So adults are more likely to have worked for some hours in trade or market services, and children are less likely to have worked in the fields. So that's important for us. If we look at the Niger side, around 50% of the children have worked between age 5 and 17 have worked in the fields for their parents. And this is, there is a reduction by 11 percentage points on the exposed side. If we look at agricultural activities, again, at the extensive margin, nothing, everyone cultivates some land, but conditional on cultivating this, they farm smaller plots in per capita terms. So it's a reduction both because there are fewer people, but also each person farms a smaller plot. There is an increase in the ownership of non-agricultural firms by around 20 percentage points. So it seems that this, the income that people derive from these non-agricultural firms and the remittances, this extra income is enough to compensate the decrease in agricultural activity. Because if we look at food insecurity, we see no deterioration. If we look at the mossy land, we find even a decrease in food insecurity, so an improvement, despite the fact that people are farming smaller plots. So we take all this as evidence that agriculture plays a smaller role in the economy on the exposed side of the border. And finally, the last piece of the causal chain is a need for child and family labor. And here we rely on our survey data where we try to understand why people want many children. And we ask people what would happen if you had fewer children than what you desire. And the only answers that are different on both sides of the border are related to child labor. I would not have enough people to help on the farm. I would not have enough people to help at home. So on the exposed side, women are 10 to 15 percentage points less likely to give this answer. Another way to try to get at need for child labor was to ask the household head, suppose that we give you suddenly more land, would you have enough people in your household currently to farm it? And if the head says no, we consider that everyone is already working at full capacity and the household is labor constrained to expand agricultural activity. And again, on the Côte d'Ivoire side, households are less likely to be labor constrained. So they seem to have some idle labor. That means that they are not trying to maximize the total food production with the labor resources that they have. One question that you may have is why, if they need less labor, why do they adjust in terms of family labor and not in terms of hired labor? And here the answer is simply that all farm labor is done by family member. In this context, you have very few hired people who work on someone else's farm. And the final test that I think really convinced us that this was about agriculture is that we have some heterogeneity by soil type. And here we borrow an index created by Paola Gobi and her co-authors, where they constructed this for the whole Africa, and they try to see whether the ecological conditions are more favorable to grow roots and tubers that require mostly land but not so much labor, compared to cereals that require more labor compared to land. And if our story is correct, the effect should be concentrated in places that grow cereals, so crops that require a lot of care, and so where children were initially very useful because there were a lot of tasks to do in agriculture. And this is what we find when we split our sample on the median of this index for Burkina Faso, that there is no effect in the places growing low labor crops, and that the effect is mostly driven by the labor-intensive areas. We consider other pathways because let's say the two main theories for why there could be an income effect could lead to a decrease in fertility is first the quality quantity trade-off, and then some non-cooperative models where you would have some female empowerment when the man is away. But we find no effect on education, no effect on health and non-productive assets. We find no effect on female empowerment, no effect on age at marriage or abstinence. And we also looked at the transmission of social norms, composition effect, and urbanization. But for all these theories, at some point, there was something inconsistent with the data. And so that's why we conclude that the most plausible channel is that when subsistence farming is the only economic activity and labor is the main factor of production, and farming is done by family members, including children, then people have large families. And these incentives tend to weaken when outside work opportunities appear for young men and households move a bit away from the subsistence constraint.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to conclude and then we can take questions. Yeah. So just to wrap up, here this is in some sense a story about the reversal of fortune of the Mosiland, in the sense that the pre-colonial kingdoms were so densely populated that they attracted the attention of the French, who targeted them as their main labor reservoir, and this led to more emigration today. And even though the migration is voluntary and people send part of their income as remittances, the economic impact seemed to be a bit more limited than in contexts where migration started without coercion, in particular the impact on education. And one potential explanation is that these patterns of low-skill circular migration do not incentivize investments in human capital. And then beyond the MOSI context, I think our results show that fertility in Africa is influenced by long-term processes shaped by colonial rule, but in ways that are complex and that we are just starting to understand. And more generally, it shows that the decisions on family formation can change if modes of production change, and that differences in family institutions can at least partially be explained by differences in the economic environment and not only by exogenous cultural differences. Yeah. Thank you.
That's incredible timing, I'd say. I mean, it's perfect timing. So now if anyone wants to ask a question, I think Palaj had a question, so I'll open the mic. But if you have a question to ask directly to Pauline, please raise your virtual hand and I'll open the mic to you. Or I mean, someone else will, because I think Palaj, you can actually speak. I think
Yeah, I'll start and then people can kind of follow up. But I mean, Pauline, this is amazing work. I might have missed this, so I apologize in advance, but I was just thinking about when you were trying to draw down the mechanisms. There's this whole story that might also go in the route of forced migration in the past, in and of itself can create contemporaneous changes, which is you have a decline in fertility either because of lack of availability of men or some kind of cultural transmission that you would probably see, and that reduces fertility, say, in the past, and that creates a persistence in terms of like how the patterns that you see in the data today. And is there a possibility of ruling that out as a potential mechanism, or should we say that that can be one of the stories along with what you've shown us so far?
So about the men, at some point we considered this idea of a change in the marriage market and the change that would persist over time. And there, our idea was a little bit more convoluted maybe than what you said, was that to make sure that the migrant returns, the elders would have to promise a wife, and that's why the migrant would send money and eventually return. And we should see a decrease in polygamy and a decrease in the age gap between husbands and wife. So that was one of our hypotheses. The problem is that when we looked at the age at first marriage, so maybe I can show that for women and for men, it was not there was no effect. So it's not true that women marry later or younger, and it's also not true that men marry younger. So we decided to leave aside this hypothesis. But I'm not sure this is exactly the mechanism you had in mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very hard to sort of think about how you will prove it because you need to get historical data, which is hard to obtain to begin with.
Yes, another thing that we wanted to do at the beginning was really to trace down, back from the effect back in the days and how this effect could have changed over time. We were not able to get historical data at a level that is granular enough and geolocalized enough so that we can do the RD. The only thing we could do with the very old census data was to show that the difference has not been there forever. Initially, there is no difference, and that the negative effect builds up over time and appears at the moment when remittances really become a thing. So when there is a stock of people in Côte d'Ivoire, and when the wage difference between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina becomes large enough so that they can remit a big part of their income. But we were not able to go back in the days as much to estimate the short run effect. We tried a lot because we would have loved to do that, but
Yeah, so I don't want to take up more time, but we can also talk offline about this. One potential way of doing the same thing would be to say use persistent climate shocks and interact that with your treatment and see whether the pattern sort of gets amplified. And then you provide more credence to the current story of this remittance and income effects sort of driving fertility changes.
okay, yeah, I'll be happy to talk more about that. We have not explored the interaction with climate.
Let's probably move on to the next question. Michael?
Yeah, hi. Just two quick questions. This is a fantastic paper. One question I have is, about the boundaries, relying on the Murdoch map, maybe, for the ethnic boundaries, since that map, was constructed for the entirety of Africa, the geography, the lines where they published the division between Mosi and other ethnic groups, there's no reason to think it has much accuracy, at least certainly not at, the 10-kilometer, 20-kilometer range. So I wondered if you had looked at village names on either sides of the 1932 border. Often village names are ethnicized, and if you could see differences across the border in the frequency of name origins of villages, that might be useful in thinking about whether the border crossed, was endogenous in terms of ethnic groups. Another question that I was curious about was about the it's kind of attrition out of the population in terms of people remaining in Côte d'Ivoire. Is that something you were able to get any data on as people were migrated out, either forced or induced, many people ended up staying in Côte d'Ivoire. So that might have, some villages have much more selective residency, permanent residency. So I was just curious about whether there was data in that. I didn't notice it in the talk.
Yes, thank you for these two questions. So you're right that I think you refer to these borders here from the Murdoch Atlas. So the good thing for us is that we are not using this border as our special RD, right? Compared to other designs that have used these borders. The border that we use for the RD is really the border for the circle. And here we're only using this area as when we restrict our sample to the Mosi homeland. But we agree that this is not ideal. So another way to do it would be to just restrict the sample to the people who declare themselves as Mosi, right? Mosi individuals. And we can do that. And we also find that the effect is stronger when we restrict to the Mosi. We have a nice placebo test where we show that there is no effect if we look at the non-Mosi. So that's telling you that it's not about other post-colonial policies that would be different in these areas, because it's really specific to the people who have the Mossi ethnicity. On the permanent migration, you're right. So some of these Burkinabés have stayed in Côte d'Ivoire, and that's something that we try to investigate. It's difficult to do it well because if you have data from Burkina Faso, you know that some people are going to Côte d'Ivoire only if they are temporary migrants. And if you have data in Côte d'Ivoire, you know that people come from Burkina Faso, but you don't know where in Burkina Faso. So there is no data set that links regions of destination and regions of origin. So the best we could do was we asked a question in our survey asking, do you have someone in this household who has permanently migrated either to a big city or abroad? And we can test whether this fraction is different on both sides. So the fraction is quite low. It's only 8%, and it's the same on both sides of the border. So it seems that the permanent migration is not selective, or at least in the proxy that we have. So what we have in mind is that here the complier is someone who is induced to migrate only if you have this very long tradition of circular migration. And this complier seems to be a temporary migrant more than a permanent migrant.
Great. Catalina? You should unmute yourself. I think, yeah. Hello, Catalina? Do you want to ask your question, or I think your hand is down. I don't know. Well, so Pauline, I have a question. I guess maybe I've asked this before. So do you expect to be the men driving the desired fertility down in this model? So it is supposed to be the man if the economic motive is what is the driver?
You mean the men compared to the women?
Yeah.
Yes. So to us, it makes sense for two reasons. One is because the man is the one in charge of managing the farm. So he's the one making the decisions. And so this pressure for, creating a new worker is supposed to come more from the men's side. So the fact that the mechanism is related to need for labor in agriculture, and that we see an effect on men's preferences, for us, it's consistent. The other good thing that it's coming from the men's side is that women tend to migrate for marriage, whereas the man is really the one staying in the family farm. So if the effect was coming mostly from women, it would be more complicated to justify, in the sense that the woman is maybe born in another village and now she moved to a different village. So the persistence channel and the fact that it's related to a specific plot of land, it makes sense that it goes through the men preferences.
Is it correct? And one of the implication you get is that the distance between desired fertility between men and women gets closer. This is my random recollection of data, but
yes, so that's true. If you look at I didn't comment on the averages, but they are always striking. If you look at the desired fertility of men, so in BFAB, we have only married men. It's 10 children, okay? While the desired fertility of women is 7.5 children. And so with this reduction of 1.1 or 1.5 children in desired fertility, the man is coming closer to the women. That's correct.
that's perfect. So, I mean, I don't know whether I don't see anyone else hands raised, though. I'm just gonna keep going on this. So these are somewhat, the flavor of reducing frictions within the household, right? So that's probably gonna be one of the very conflictual objectives. We actually talked about this, but so have you thought about like thinking seriously about this? There's there's less deadweight loss now because we agree on we're sort of almost in agreement on the number of children given the effects. And maybe you can answer this later because Barbara has a question, so I'd rather have Barbara ask. No? Barbara, your hand was raised before. Was it like random? Oh. Yeah. So okay.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was using Catalina's link. I think she sent me the link and I just somehow went through it. But I'm Nicolas Pasos. I'm at UIUC also.
Oh, okay. So okay.
Sorry.
That
Yeah,
was
sorry, it's my bad. I made that mistake.
Did you have a question now?
Yeah, great presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. I just have one question, just very quick question. So you haven't showed us any results on the non-multi-land people. I was wondering if you have tried that or maybe I missed it. And the other question is and you already answered this in a previous question, but I also just wanted to add. So you're saying because you can use the ethnicity of the DHS to find who is still a Mossy individual. I was wondering, oh sorry, I missed it. But I was wondering if you have tried using Mossy people within Mossy land and non-Mossy people within Mossy land, because that might tell you something else about return from migration. If people left the Mossy land and then came back, or people left other areas and then came back, I would assume the Mossy people within the Mossy land are the most the closest to people that experience the first wave of forced, or that were left after the first wave of forced migration. Does that make sense? Am I saying something that
Yes, so we tried this. So sorry, I don't have the button here. We added the test in the revision actually, but not in the slides. There is no effect on the non-Mossy individuals, but this is within the whole bandwidth. We don't have enough non-Mossy people within the Mossy land. So we tried something along the lines you described, but in fact, within the Mossy land, it's almost only people who report themselves as Mossy today. So we could not do that.
Thank you.
But the question, I think, was more about the Mossy in, if I'm not mistaken, the Mossy in non-Mossy land.
Well, yeah, Mossy, non-Mossy land, non-Mossy in Mossy land in general, those variations that may exist, but I'm
yes. So on the Mossy, it's as expected. If they are in the Mossy land, it's even stronger than if they are outside the Mossy land. But for the non-Mossy, we cannot do the comparison. We find zero effect for them. But we cannot distinguish between non-Mossy and Mossy.
Let me try Barbara again, because I think she wanted to ask a question like some times ago and then something happened. Barbara?
Okay, yes. I wanted to ask if she can explain the social norms transmission mechanism.
Yes, so the social norm, the idea was that maybe people go to Côte d'Ivoire, they learn about the normal family size is 5 and not 7, and so when they come back to Burkina Faso, they move towards 5 and not 7. So here I have some distribution that I can show you the way we yes. If we look at the distribution for desired fertility, and we compare Côte d'Ivoire is the pink and the Burkina Faso is the white one. In fact, the desired fertility is much smaller in Côte d'Ivoire. You even have a peak at 10 that you don't observe in Burkina Faso, where Burkina Faso is closer to 4 or 5. And same thing for completed fertility. The distribution is a bit more widespread in Côte d'Ivoire, but it's not obvious that when you come back from Côte d'Ivoire, you come with a completely different norm and a lower norm than from Burkina Faso. So that's why we discarded this. And if we look at the averages, the average desired fertility is 5.97 in Côte d'Ivoire and 5.65 in the Burkina Faso side of the border. So it would be very hard to say that this is a cultural remittances.
In keeping with the exceptional timing of Pauline, it's pretty impressive, and all the attendees. That's it, essentially. Thank you so much, Pauline, for this, and Camille as well. Pauline is going to be on her link. I think Nico has posted it. Please just copy and paste it somewhere, because as soon as we close this down, you're not going to be able to access it. In a couple of weeks, we'll see you again with, there you go. Perfect. So all perfect timing today. Incredible. So thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure as usual. Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, all the others, and see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Giacomo.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.